Hello, and welcome to Restoring Hope, the podcast of Missionaries of the Precious Blood. My name is Patrick Higgins. I'm the Executive Director of Communications for the congregation, and I'm your host. So today we are happy and thrilled, actually, to welcome Chris Stepien, author, journalist, and member of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, who's done a lot of work with Missionaries of the Precious Blood and whose own spirituality and evangelization is rooted in the tenets of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. So, Chris, welcome. Thank you for being our guest today.
Patrick, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Chris, I'd like to kind of start off with your general background, how you came to work with Missionaries of the Precious Blood, and then we'll kind of delve into your experience from there.
Well, I'm a longtime Detroiter, but now I live in Chicago, and that's really part of the story. That God works in strange ways. A buddy of mine says, a priest friend says, God draws straight with crooked lines. So here's the circuitous story, right? So in 2017, my wife Ellen and I moved here to Chicago to be closer to our sons and our growing family. And it lived in Detroit prior to that for 60 years and had been in media, broadcast television, advertising, and marketing. And I decided I wanted to wind my media career down and really build on my experience as a Vincentian. Both Ellen and I had been Vincentians for 17 years in the Detroit area, visiting the needy in their homes. You know, that's the core ministry of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, going in pairs like Jesus sent his disciples and serving the needy and really, truly being served by them, kind of like the servant song. Pray that I have the grace to let you be my servant too. So when I got here, I thought, well, could I get a job in in some type of ministry to use those skills? And you know, God takes care of his fools, I like to say. A publishing friend, a new friend in Chicago said, you need a spiritual director. And my spiritual director, Father Dominic Grassi, also an author, by the way, um, uh, I asked Father Dom, I said, hey, I need to get a job. You know, I'm 60, I need to work a few years. And so through his connections, one of the contacts was Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, Father Dave Kelly. And that's a mouthful, right? Precious Blood
It
Ministry of
is.
Reconciliation. I always tell friends, think peanutbuttermister.org.
Yes.
So I went there. I said, Father Dave was very welcoming. And I said, I would like to volunteer with the hopes of landing a position here or elsewhere.
And Chris,
And
could you kind of tell our listeners what the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation is?
okay, I'll tell you their quick history. So many years, you know, for those of you who might not know, if you're not part of the ministry, Precious Blood, the missionaries of Precious Blood are a global order of priests, nuns, and brothers who have missionaries all over the missions all over the world. And after many years, the American priests and brothers and sisters serving in prison ministries decided that they needed to open a mission in an American city traumatized by poverty, violence, and incarceration. And so they got this idea, and in 2002, they opened one in the back of the yard, Chicago. That's the scene of Upton Sinclair's famous novel, The Jungle. And the things are the same as they were more than 100 years ago. The only thing that's really changed is the neighborhood's no longer filled with, you know, Poles and German and Slavic people. It's people of African American and Latino descent. That's what's changed. But all the problems are still there that people have who are struggling, especially afflicted by those issues of poverty, violence, and incarceration. And Precious Blood, PBMR, brings hospitality, radical hospitality, hope, and healing to that community. That is their ministry. And so they're celebrating more than 20 years there now in the back of the yards. And so I was new to Chicago, and I'm going to Chicago's South Side and hoping to volunteer and use my meager skills that I had gained from the St. Vincent de Paul.
Okay, great, great. Okay, thank you. That draws a pretty clear picture for our listeners. So you went to PBMR, Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation.
And little did I know that God had a plan, that I believe the reason I went there was not for the job. God wanted me to experience the spirituality of the precious blood to heal me so that I could come to, for the first time in my life, genuinely realize and begin to understand the generational war trauma that my parents and my family experienced. So when I was first volunteering, one of the first tasks, I was working in the screen printing and the education lab as a volunteer, mentoring there, but I was a volunteer. And the development director at that time, Kathy, asked me, "Hey, let's use some of your media skills. If you could interview a few people, we could publish some articles and use it for fundraising." And so the first interview I had was with Artrice Hill. She was our case management supervisor at the time, and she was explaining trauma to me and the behaviors that people take on when they live and trying to survive in trauma. Well, understanding that Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation is a trauma-informed ministry, and they also teach peace circle keeping. So they're oriented toward understanding trauma. And she starts to explain these behaviors to me, and I had this epiphany. I mean, almost an out of body experience. I was recording and typing, but standing outside myself, and I went, oh my gosh, of course, mom and dad had some of these behaviors. Because you see, my mom and dad had a front row seat for the Nazi occupation of Poland. My mom was 10, my dad was 18 when the tanks and troops started rolling in, and all the soldiers from around the world, Russia, Ukraine. My mom said they even saw Mongolian soldiers. They would sleep on the banks of the San River at night so that they weren't in their homes so they couldn't be captured. And they would hear all these different languages, including the Polish underground. My mom was actually captured by the Gestapo. My dad had a submachine gun under his chin, Luger at the back of the head. So they lived through trauma. And then, of course, I realized that that experience was passed on to us by certain behaviors that they had to take on and to survive. And so young people or older people who are living in communities, whether it's in Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, or Chicago, Dallas, any place where people feel threatened and they're actively in the mode of surviving, take on these behaviors. And suddenly it was like a wound deep down inside of me was torn open, but for healing, that God had said, this is why, this is why some of the things occurred in your family that you considered normal. Simple example would be like hypervigilance or need to be perfect, because if you made a mistake, it could kill you or your family member. My dad and his brothers used to practice lying in a haystack while someone else stabbed it with a pitchfork, because that's how far the Nazis would go. So, but see, growing up in the 50s, I was born in 57, and you watched films, Hollywood films or Combat with Vic Morrow. The stories I heard growing up matched that. Nobody talked about PTSD. Nobody talked about trauma. In fact, the days of our lives, the best days of our lives. Remember that movie that featured the soldier with the hooks, the prosthetic hands. That was the closest they came really to really bringing out war trauma and how it's. And we're all fighting wars to this day. It's red state, blue state, orthodox versus progressive. Race versus race. You name it, religion versus religion, country versus country, and we keep repeating these things because of this deep-rooted trauma inside of us. We tend to be retributive in our justice instead of restorative in our justice, and that's the script that Precious Blood flips.
So it sounds like your parents were not reticent about telling you about their trauma. Did so they spoke about it. They relayed to you what they had gone through.
Yes, and they were storytellers, especially my mom, and I think it was because her dad died in May of 1939, and the war broke out September 1930. So for her, my dad was 18, mom was 10. So dad talked about it, but mom more.
So and that knowledge that they had imparted to you it served as a background when you went to work with Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation.
Once I learned that in that moment, I can't even describe to you what it meant to me. And so about 4 months later, once again, God takes care of his fools, thanks to a grant from Cook County. PBMR needed a workforce development coordinator, and Father Dave asked me if I would consider the position, and I went for it. It was exciting because I could leverage my skills, communications, and my wife Ellen and I had owned co-owned a couple of marketing and advertising companies, so I could use that ability to find work to teach others to pursue work and careers.
So, can you give us some examples of some of the trauma that you worked with, and then how you would employ your spirituality or the spirituality of either the Vincentians or missionaries of the precious blood to help victims work through that trauma?
Well, most of all, it's what I learned at PBMR. See, let me try to explain radical hospitality, radical engagement, radical accompaniment. One of the first things I had to learn is even though we had goals for workforce development, it was more important to radically accompany people than to try to get the results of a job and having them in a job for 6 months or a career. That was important, okay? But more important was to be there with them, sit with them in their wounds, because that's the spirituality of the precious blood, as I understand it, is that when we sit with somebody in their trauma, in their struggle, it's like touching the fresh wounds of Jesus the way Thomas did. And we are then healed, just like I was healed by learning about someone else's trauma. In other words, when I go to wash feet, I can actually see it's a pretty intimate event, right? And so accompanying people along. So one of the things that we would do is just be continuously encouraging, helping people try to get their court record expunged, looking for opportunities, listening, just actively listening to people, being for them, and being for them whether they fail, being there with them whether they failed or succeeded. Let me give you an example. So in the St. Vincent de Paul home visits, it's about serving the needy, responding to an immediate need, maybe paying a light bill, keeping the power on, extending their stay in the home, and then we're off to the next case usually. You might have a little bit more long-term relationship, but typically not. Precious Blood is about building this relationship and accompanying this person along the road. It's actually like the world teaches retribution, the world teaches judgment. I had to relearn a next level of service. I compare it to like walking backward on a treadmill. Let me explain. I once had a bad left knee. I was on a cane due to some autoimmune illnesses that I have. And I went through 4 weeks of therapy. And the first 3 weeks, things got better, but I was still limping, even though I didn't have pain. And the therapist said, you know what we're going to do? In week 4, I'm going to have you walk on a treadmill backwards so that you can teach your brain to unlearn the limp. You have to teach your brain to change the way that it's operating. And and it worked. I walked backwards on that treadmill and got rid of the limp. Precious Blood is that radical thing. It teaches us to unlearn the idea of retribution, or why aren't you following through? You missed that appointment. Why were you late for class? It's bringing people along and accompanying them, and in that way, that's hope, that's hospitality, that's healing, and they can then turn to us if they just need somebody to talk to, or they do have success and they celebrate because there were success stories. But the success stories, I think Jesus would agree with this. We don't even realize how we're helping somebody else. We don't know what their problems are most of the time. We don't really know what their heart is. So how can we ultimately know what the full benefit of what um, our service is? That's why he said, I believe, go and learn the meaning of I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He wants us to be merciful, even when it's difficult to be merciful towards somebody who we don't get along with, right? I hope that's helpful. It's the idea of being radical in our service.
Yeah, that's exceptionally helpful. So, is it correct of me to say that the ministry that you did and that Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation continues to do could be described as helping people relieve themselves of the pain, but to live with the scar? Is that accurate?
It fascinating you mentioned that because I was just at Precious Blood. They have first Sunday of the month Mass. I was just there yesterday, and Father talked about wounds and scars as part of his homily, Father Dave. So it's a great way to put it. It's about but I don't want to lose. This is, I guess, my Vincentian view. You know, Matthew 25, verse 31 to 46. Did you feed me? Did you clothe me? Did you quench my thirst? Did you welcome me as a stranger? Did you visit me when I was sick or in prison? To see Jesus in that person, it's as much for me as it is for them. But to answer your question, it's about being with them. That's my simple head, how it understands it, to accompany them. Like be Simon of Cyrene and carry Jesus's cross, like in the moment, right? He goes and he carries that cross, and then he doesn't know Jesus, but he steps into that role. And so we're in that role and we don't realize that that's the key, to look at that person and say, I'm accompanying Jesus because Jesus was wounded. Jesus was incarcerated. Jesus was accused. Jesus was arrested. You know, they had the Pietà statue on the campus there, and I'd sometimes sit there and take a break and just sit in front of the statue and think about the mothers in the neighborhood who held the bodies of their mothers and fathers held the bodies of their dead children, or the mothers and fathers who had to have their kids incarcerated. This is a connection to the Holy Family. This is a connection to the basis of the core of our faith, right? Forgive.
So how? I guess I've got a lot of questions. So can you walk us through maybe some of the more severe cases of trauma that you would have worked with at PBMR and the process of helping someone work through that work? Because they experienced, people that you work with at PBMR experience trauma on a severe level, obviously a level that most of us have never and hopefully will never know. So what is it that you can do for victims of trauma, or what is it that I can do? You know, not working closely with PBMR. What is it that I can do?
Well, first of all, we have to be radical. So we're going to get on our treadmill, walk backwards, and the first thing to do is, as Jesus said, stop judging. Literally, stop judging. It says in Matthew, or you will be judged. Because I don't know what that other person's gone through. There are people who we accompanied. I had staff members, colleagues who had been formerly incarcerated for decades. You know, they had committed a crime when they were serious crime when they were teenagers, and they had spent decades in prison. And these people, many of them ended up flourishing. But some of the cases we work with, if you're in prison, like I'm thinking of a particular guy right now, had been in prison for decades, and he was very successful in terms of education. He got an education, he got a skill, and he came out and he said, I don't want to use that skill because that skill would force me to sit in a laboratory. And I've been sitting in a place for over 20 years. I want to be a truck driver so I can feel free. Just think about that for a second. Very counterintuitive. You and I would go, hey, I got this ticket. It's going to get me a job. It's going to pay well. But there are a lot of hidden scars that people carry with them. And many times, if you've been incarcerated as a teenager, you probably had a very difficult childhood. An example, I didn't work on this case, but I became aware of it. So remember I said that Precious Blood, Ministry of Reconciliation, teaches peace circle keeping. And what is that?
What is
Well,
that?
it's
Yes.
built on the traditions, ancient in many cases, traditions of Aboriginal people all over the world, including the Americas, where people would sit in community to resolve conflict, to build consensus, sometimes to celebrate things. In fact, in the Rwandan genocide, a they actually, some of the cases, hundreds of thousands of cases of genocide, right? They have a modern court system, but they handled some of the cases in community. It's called gachacha, justice on the grass. The community sat in circle in community, and the people who had lost a loved one to genocide faced the person who was the accused assailant, and they would meet face to face and have a conversation and resolve this. In fact, here in the United States and in Chicago, thanks to restorative justice hubs like Precious Blood, which Precious Blood is part of in Chicago. Now some of these techniques are being used. They're using circles in juvenile courts. So that instead of just punishing, retributive, you're trying to restore the situation. Well, I became aware of there was a woman I worked with, Cynthia, and I worked with some of her kids in the workforce development program. Just before I retired in 2022, there was a People magazine article about Cynthia and a young gentleman named Xavier. Xavier and Cynthia and Cynthia's family met in a peace circle. And Xavier had been involved in a youth gang that had murdered Cynthia's brother Pedro many years earlier. And he had gone, at 13 years old, he was arrested. 14, he was incarcerated. He was supposed to go in for 25 years. He got an education. He came out. He now is the executive director for the campaign for fair sentencing of youth. But they were able to meet in face to face. They were able to share their experience for Cynthia and her family, their pain for Xavier, his guilt. You can read it. It's written up in People magazine, December 29th, 2021. Great story. And so the point is, imagine that trauma and then overcoming the trauma of losing a loved one and overcoming the trauma, the guilt, because I look at it as the spiritual law of physics. If I hit you, okay, you're hurt, but I hurt myself. That's another thing I learned at Precious Blood. Hurt people. And that connected back to my experience with, my family situation is that they had a lot of trauma in them. Now I love my parents. They were loving parents, but they had challenges to overcome and there was nobody helping them. So that's the big radical difference. Now Precious Blood is saying, what I want to be informed of your trauma. I want to be open to understand. I want to open my heart, the ears and eyes of my heart, to allow the Holy Spirit to allow me to be humble and accompany you on your way in whatever that is. Whether it's you've been incarcerated, whether you or your family have been a victim of gun violence. I met a guy who was surgically altered due to a gunshot wound, and he was trying to recover from that and trying to get a job, and he needed another surgery. On the other hand, I met kids who had been incarcerated and they're high flyers. They went and got training in a skill and were able to get jobs and move on. There was a full spectrum of situations. I always used to like to say, some of these people have high school, college diplomas. Some of them don't. Some of these people were teenage mothers and fathers. Some of them are not. In other words, don't stereotype. Look at each person as an individual and get to know them. And not by quizzing them or being too nosy, but by being a friend to them, welcoming them regardless of the circumstance. Think of that the father of the prodigal son. That kid isn't really sorry. He's hungry. If you
Yes,
really,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
if I go, my dad will hire me and I can eat. And then, but he ends up at a big party with a ring on his finger and a robe. And his brother's not happy. But the brother needed to walk backward on a treadmill with dad to unlearn the idea that, hey, I did all the right things. Why are you celebrating him? And he says, because he was lost and now he's found. So I think that spirituality goes hand in hand that with exactly what Precious Blood is doing is how it reinforced my Vincentian experience of saying, look at these people as Jesus. Hey, you know what? Here's something that maybe will be helpful. How do I not judge somebody who had been incarcerated or somebody who had committed a
Yes.
murder, right? How
That
do I
was one
do
of my
that?
questions. Right. Absolutely.
Well, every opportunity that I think about judging you is an opportunity to look inside myself. The splinter in the log that Jesus said, before I reach for that splinter, chisel that log out of my eye. Well, hey, when I was a young person, a young adult, back in the day, there was no campaign. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. Many times I drove and it was like a badge of courage, an honor. Hey, did you make it home? Yeah, I made it home. I used the hood ornament as a sight to get in the garage. In other words, I could have killed somebody. I could have hurt myself. I could have been arrested. I could have been, spent some time in jail. How would that have affected my career, my life, my self worth? How would that have affected me? So, if I'm being genuinely honest, when I'm when I'm struggling to understand how could someone do that, I probably should be saying, how could someone do that? Like, get to know them. Like, don't ask rhetorical questions, accompany them. When I go into an emergency room, if I and I used to be 8 pant sizes bigger. So when I go into an emergency room, let's say, and I had heart disease, this didn't happen, but the first thing they're not gonna say to me, oh, you really need to lose some weight, and we're going to give you a recommendation on how to exercise and diet. No, they deal with the heart disease. So that's what precious blood does. It follows Pope Francis' beautiful image of strive to make the church a field hospital, right? In other words, be there to welcome, wash feet, console, heal radically, and then allows the person the space to get better. If I was overweight, the doctor's not going to lose, isn't going to lose weight for me. No one can, Ellen couldn't say anything to get me to lose weight. I have to make that change. But if somebody accompanies me, and in fact, I have to give credit to my wife. All those years, she never said anything about my weight. And she just, yeah, one time she said, I'm getting older. But that was it. I mean, in all those years, and this went on for decades. But that was radical accompaniment. I didn't even, in this moment, I realized under my own roof that I had that kindness, that experience. I remember going to a doctor once and him saying, "Hey, I guess we should be happy you didn't gain any weight." Oh, that made me hungry. I was hurt in that moment. I felt like, hey, I had worked really hard not to gain any weight. So we don't, it doesn't mean that we're not throwing away consequences. Understanding someone's trauma doesn't mean that we say that what you did was okay. It's understanding. It's just like any of us has pain, and sometimes it seems irrational to other people. But if we walk backward on that treadmill, we begin to open our eyes and look at it through the lens that Jesus was trying to craft us. That's why he's trying to get that stuff out of our eyes.
It sounds like a prerequisite to for wanting to I'm sorry, a prerequisite for forgiving someone is to want to forgive them, is to want to reconcile. Is that correct?
You brought up a huge topic. So, I think it's just as important for us to know uh, the way that Jesus died for us as how he died for us. Let me explain. He dies crucified, brutal, right? The torture beyond imagination for us. And he dies. This is the way he dies. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He dies turning the other cheek, fulfilling everything he asks us to do, and he's advocating for his executioners in the moment, in that pain. So sometimes I guess maybe I don't want to forgive, but I guess in my simple mind I've come to realize that it's lancing that wound, it's letting the pus out, it's relieving my pain. Forgiveness is actually first for me, then for the person I forgive, because I don't know how they're going to receive it, right? They might say, hey, I think this is your problem. This is not my problem. What do you mean I forgive you? We've all been in situations like that at some level or another, right? So it's for us. It's for coming. All of this is for Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats clause, I like to call it, written by the divine attorney. There are no loopholes in there. Remember, he does. Did you do this for me? Oh, when did we do this for you? Well, when you did it for the least. You didn't do this for me. When didn't we do it? When you didn't do it for. It's literally like a legal contract. He's saying this is how we're going to be judged. And he's trying to teach us that the mercy, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. It's all this, everything has an equal and opposite reaction. It's like I think of it as spiritual physics. It's like to heal me, I have to be willing to heal you. To forgive myself, I have to be willing to forgive you. I just believe that now. And that precious blood helped me really come to understand that, because it lengthened the time that I could spend with a person as opposed to a home visit that might last an hour or two. And I remember in prayer, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But remember, Jesus said, well, stay with folks, and as long as they let you stay with them. And He stayed with the woman at the well. Remember that? The Samaritan woman? He ends up staying with them in Samaria, the heretics, the outcasts, right? He stays with them. And I think that's radical hospitality. Hospitality that's something we did in the St. Vincent de Paul. Sometimes poor people would offer you something to drink and eat, and we were always instructed and learned, always accept it. Always accept it, because they want to be generous to you even though you're there and they're asking for help. It's this idea that I am being served more than I should. And that's the case at Precious Blood. I got so much more out of it than I could ever hope to bring to it. I just, it healed me. And by that I mean it helped me regrow that scar, as you referred to earlier. But the wound had to be open to understand it.
Chris, how do you marry your background with Vincentians? I always have trouble pronouncing that. And your background in the spirituality of missionaries of the precious blood.
Well, I think of them as a river or a stream. One flows into the other. So the Vincentian spirituality is about Matthew 25. In fact, great question. Glad you asked that, because I used to think about when I read Matthew 25, and it ends with, did you visit me when I was sick, and did you visit me when I was in prison? Well, visiting somebody in prison is actually not that easy. I looked at a prison ministry once, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops. You can write letters, you can be a pen pal, but it's hard to visit someone in prison. And so when I went to Precious Blood, it gave me the access to that last step, that last question. If Jesus were to ask me, did you visit me in prison? Well, I didn't go to prison, but I worked with a lot of people who had been incarcerated, and some people ended up being incarcerated while they were there. I had a pleasure of having a young man who recently came back out of incarceration give me a hug yesterday at Mass at the Precious Blood Center. So that's how they flow into one another. PBMR takes you to the next level. It's more radical. The St. Vincent de Paul works through, your parish, if it has a chapter, we call them conferences, and then you go out to your community. A place like Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation says, no, come out to the margin, come out to the south side, come out to where people stay away from, and come here and serve, and you will be healed, because it's more like surgery. The other is like a diagnostic visit with the doctor. This is more like surgery, because the wounds generally are deeper.
Well, thank you, Chris Stepien, for being our guest today on Restoring Hope. We appreciate your time, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about. If you want to learn more about Missionaries of the Precious Blood, we are at preciousbloodus.org, and you can also find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. So thank you, Chris Stepien, and thank you to our listeners. This is Restoring Hope, and we will see you again soon.